Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Nichtern, author and senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
So, all right. Hello, everybody. This is Ethan Nichtern. This is the Road Home podcast. Really excited to be joined today by my friend, Dr. Chris Willard, who is author of several books on mindfulness, youth. One is Growing Up Mindful. The other is Raising Resilience. You're a therapist based in the Boston area. And I want to have a conversation about how both parents and children can wake up. So I turn to you first. And thanks so much for being on the podcast, Chris.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and it's such a fun conversation, and to have with other parents and other practitioners. It's a real challenge, I think, for our generation that is growing into this and raising kids and trying to figure out these practices have been so helpful for us. How do we start to share these in our families? How do we start to pass these on? And it's great. So I'm psyched to be here.
So how did you get into I guess the three things that you're kind of combining? One is a study of Buddhism and the secular mindfulness that comes out of that. Your psychological training and your work with teenagers and adolescents and children. How did those three things start or come together for you?
Well, they really started with, they started with mindfulness, although when I was a kid, what I tend to tell people is I never heard the word mindfulness when I was a kid. And my parents, they weren't particularly interested in mindfulness, never threw that word around the house. But I kind of have some of my favorite memories. I look back and I remember things like being at nature camp. And they'd say, let's just listen to all the sounds of the forest, right? Can you hear the leaves dropping from the trees? Can you hear the trees whispering to each other, right? And things like this. And years later, realizing, that was like a mindful listening practice. Or walking in the woods as quietly as we could without making a sound. And then I learned mindful walking years later, and that was kind of, very similar. It takes so much focus to walk without making a sound. Or being with my dad and just watching clouds up in the sky kind of appearing and disappearing and learning about impermanence. And he said, if you breathe and focus on the cloud, you can make it disappear. And so that's, again, then, it was maybe 20, 22, something like that, when I first started hearing the word mindfulness and got interested in it, which to me came out of, which I think probably for a lot of people comes out of suffering, right? It's like I was in college, I was taking time off, my life was a total mess. I was struggling with mental health stuff. I had a major addiction problem and was just trying to figure out, what could I do to get back on track, have my life be more meaningful. And by that point, my parents had gotten really interested in mindfulness. They'd taken a MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction course. They were doing a lot of stuff with, going on retreats with Thich Nhat Hanh. And they basically dragged me on this retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh because they didn't know what else to do with me. And so what happened from there was suddenly, actually, things started to make sense. They started to make sense for the first time in my life since I had been a kid. Things felt less confusing. The world felt more both engaging and worthwhile. Things felt meaningful. I felt calmer. I felt clearer. I felt more creative. And from there, things just started to kind of transform. And I thought, man, I wish I'd learned this stuff when I was younger. I might not have ended up such a mess. But what I want to do is figure out ways to share this with other people, especially young people. So I went back to college, finished up, worked as a special ed teacher for a few years, which was frankly a total disaster. I had no training in education, had no idea what I was doing. And it was a therapeutic school with like kids that were just out of jail, like a lot of juvenile sex offenders. It was a really challenging population. And I saw, the therapist in that setting and was thinking, I like their job. They've got a good job. And so kind of went down the path of becoming a therapist. And that was a time kind of in the 2000s when mindfulness was really making inroads into the therapeutic world. right? Like MBSR was being proven. Therapists were going on retreats, dialectical behavioral therapy. These other things were coming together, and it felt like this really exciting time to be in school and to be thinking, oh, these practices have been helpful for me. Now it's true. They actually are helpful for other people. And so that's kind of what got me, that's the long version of what got me really started on this path. So.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, your story and that you started working with adolescents. I mean, that's when I got interested in meditation and really was interested in Buddhist philosophy a little bit more first. And it was interesting because I had, as a teenager, high school student, I had such an access point, which was both my parents were part of a Buddhist community and taught meditation and so forth. And I also had such a repulsion point because both my parents were Buddhist.
Right.
And anything I projected onto their problems with each other or my problems with each of them could also go on to, the label of their my parents are awful because they're Buddhists,
Right.
I love them both very much. So
I look forward to my kids doing that to me too in a few more years.
So I'm trying to access my my memory of that time in terms of like what actually did turn me on or turn me off about meditation or looking at the mind, etc. Do you find certain entry points for adolescents that you work with that are really like, or is it very individual when you're working with different young folks, or is there sort of like a way that they all come to it that you've noticed, or a way that really gains their curiosity when you're working with them on meditation or mindfulness or any of these concepts?
Yeah, I think it's really different for every kid. A lot of kids get kind of sent to me by their parents with the, note stuck to their back that says, fix this kid almost, right? And so kids come in pretty defensive. And, and oftentimes nowadays, kids come in, their parents are like, fix my kid with mindfulness. And so the kids are even more skeptical and not so sure about meeting with me. And it really just starts with like building a trusting relationship with them. If they see that I'm not threatening, that I don't have some big agenda. And if I take a stance of, what we know from the ancient wisdom, right? Ehipassiko, come and see for yourself, right? It's like, well, here's this thing that you might find helpful. Here's this thing that might help with your anxiety. Here's this thing that, you might find interesting as you're growing up and trying to make sense of this world. This has helped a lot of people make sense of the world. And so, sometimes it's really niche specific. A kid comes in, they have panic attacks, and okay, well, here's some ways to regulate your breath. Other kids come in and they really are just more kind of, in that existential, what is life all about? How do I discover it for myself? I don't want someone to tell me what life is about. And that to me is where mindfulness, where some of these contemplative practices are so beautiful and so helpful with helping kids get a sense of what am I about? Who am I in this world? What is this world about? Answering some of those big questions that start to bubble up as they get into adolescence. So it can be such a broad range of different entry points. I think that's part of what's so powerful about this stuff.
Do you think for adolescents, I mean, one of the ideas I've always had is that part of practicing at least formal meditation and really making that relationship with your own mind is based on a kind of willingness to be bored, like sort of a willingness for your entertainment mind to be disappointed. And so, is that a difficult selling point for especially in this era, like the notion of, and I'm not even just speaking of kids here, but like putting down the device and actually like paying attention to the slow dribble of slightly dissatisfying sense perceptions and mental events, and actually learning to appreciate those. Is that a tougher sell for an adolescent audience than say a 20-something, 30-something, 60-something audience?
Well, you're definitely making a tough sell when you put it that way. I do think in some ways yes, in some ways no. I do feel like more and more kids are really ambivalent to their relationships with their technology and really seeking authentic connection with themselves and with other people. and it's figuring out how to access that, because that seed is in there, and how to, that thread is in there, how to kind of keep pulling that out. And that's through sort of explaining this in terms of what are their other interests. I think also this is where groups can be helpful. This is where I think people like, Jessica Mori doing the work she's doing with IBME is incredible, because it's getting kids together and off their devices, whereas it's harder to tell a kid alone to get off their device in some ways. But again, I think, kids, I don't know how to say this without sounding awful, right? But teenagers are in some ways like inherently kind of narcissistic and self-focused. They're also very focused on their friendships. But again, if we make the angle and the interest point on these, like, well, you're interested in yourself. This is really learning about yourself. This is getting to know your mind, getting to know your experience, and it'll be boring at times, but life will be boring at times. Your friends will be boring at times. Your device will get boring at times. And this is about learning how to connect, not just with yourself, but connect with other people. And that becomes an entry point, because kids are really interested in connecting with others, and figuring out kind of where they stand in the world. So I do think it's not as hard as we might think it is. I think that there's a misconception that, kids are going to get too easily bored by this. And I think actually maybe that was true a few years ago. I think we're starting to kind of turn the corner on that a little bit. And kids are more curious about what else is out there. And as they get, I think, the Buddha himself, right? He, instant gratification all the time, had whatever he wanted, got bored of it, and saw what else is really out there. And that happens to adults at different points in their lives. I think because kids get such instant gratification at such a young age with their devices, and in so many ways, right? They're curious at a younger age what else is out there. And so that's actually an opportunity.
So I wanted to sort of switch gears, because, even though I know you work with this population quite a lot, and your books are really, well, I've only read one of your books, but I trust you because I've heard you speak several times, and you're an awesome speaker. So I'm going to assume that the book I haven't read you said it's better than the book that I have read.
I like to think so.
The one I've read is Growing Up Mindful. So I know you work with this population, but really what I was thinking of in terms of our conversation, it's a question I get asked so often is more being the caretaker of children and being a practitioner, being a parent, et cetera, and how much that actually shifts one's own meditation practice or study, et cetera. And it's interesting. I only have a toddler. I have a 15, 16-month-old, but people have been telling me I need to write about, parenting, and my response is sort of like, give me some time to
to figure this out,
to learn something about it. But it really is. It's such an arena of experience, and such an arena of guilt and shame and delight and the possibility for awakening. But
right. 10,000 joys and sorrows. That's just one day of parenting.
But it's interesting in terms of like I used to joke within the Shambhala community that people would basically disappear from the curricular or programmatic path within that community when they became parents, often people in their 30s and 40s. So you'd go on a retreat and it would be mostly people in their 20s or 60s,
Yep.
There's a sense that when you become a parent, you kind of, that's your life and that's your world. And we do have this idea that you can wake up doing anything, right? But we were joking before we went live that we're both sick from our children right now. We both have colds. Don't ever let a toddler make out with you. They really want to.
They really do.
Yeah. So, I mean, how does it, have you thought a lot about like parenting as a complete path of awakening? Because it always feels like it's sort of this disruption of one's path of meditation that, you're doing this service, you're being a bodhisattva for these little helpless beings and trying to help their nervous system not be too scarred as it enters adulthood. But Like,
just scarred enough.
do parents often ask you, like, I feel like I'm off the path because I'm parenting and that sucks? You know, do parents have
Yeah.
jokes about that?
Yeah, this comes up a lot. I mean, to me, I think the main place it comes up, and I'm sure you can relate, is, and it's actually a pretty Western phenomenon that we tend to think of, you know, if you're a Buddhist, if you're a practitioner, that means you practice. And what practice means is you're practicing on your cushion in some way that's like formal and still. And in fact, you know, the reality is in other parts of the world that is not the case and hasn't particularly been the case. That people who are considered practitioners or on a path are supposed to be sitting down in stillness all the time. And I do think it's important that we try to do that, but that just really in so many ways goes out the window. I mean, there's those moments, you know, I think that we can find that are, you know, just holding our small baby and rocking him to sleep, and, you know, and just focusing on our breath and being with them fully in that moment. Or, you know, sometimes it's laying down when my son's trying to fall asleep and trying to practice, you know, at bedtime. That usually leads to me falling asleep. You know, or other little moments that I might have. One thing I've actually, so we're not big on screens in our family, but when I have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old, I guess I should preface it with that. So my son never watched a lot of screens.
Total chaos to me.
It's quasi chaos. And, you know, but it was like, you know, suddenly that, you know, our daughter was born, and like, then my son got a half an hour of screen time every night. And that is a bit of a relief. And he wants us to often sit there with him. And I'll actually sit there with him in like Daniel Tiger's going, and I'll just like focus on my breath and try to focus on the sounds without focusing on the content, and try to have 22 minutes of practice that way, which sounds crazy, but it actually, you know, it is something. But I think the shift is really going from formal practice into informal practice. And what I am grateful for is that I had many years of formal practice, because it makes me aware of not everything that's happening at every moment, but a lot more of what's happening in that interplay between him and I, in the interplay between my wife and I, between the 3 of us, and between the 4 of us, now that there's 4 of us, and just being that much more aware. So the formal practice, I think, really shifts. And I think part of what happens is our expectations shift, right? Which is where we attach to these expectations of, I'm going to be on this path, I'm going to sit every day, and then suddenly have a kid, and it's not like that anymore. So it's getting comfortable with the acceptance of our practice is going to look really different. And I think that's really okay. We have to find what that is. And then I think the other thing that what else sustains our practice, right? You know, there's wisdom, but there's also, you know, community. And so finding, or if you can't find it, having to create your own kind of parenting sangha in some ways, even if that's just a couple times a year you get together with other folks, whether it's to sit or whether it's just to talk about some of these concepts as they relate to parenting. And that may be incumbent on you to start, right? It won't just appear before us. So trying to remember that too.
Do you have any practices either from your Eastern or Western psychological work for working with parental guilt? Like, you know, the I'm doing an awful job of this, or I'm screwing up this child. Is it just self-compassion or loving kindness, or is there anything? Because that's what I hear so often, is just like myself, my wife, friends, like that fear of like, maybe I'm just reproducing samsara here, and it's all my fault in the next generation.
I mean, from the Western model, it's Winnicott's kind of good enough parent or good enough mother, as you know, because it was kind of older times back then. But you just have to be good enough. You don't have to be too perfect. That's really what your kid needs for, you know, to be successfully attached and successful. There's that cold coming in, and then successfully launched down the road. And then I do think self-compassion, actually started writing a self-compassion parenting book, and it was so much chaos with kids and with other stuff in my life that I had to self-compassionately decide I'm not going to write that book right now, and step back from it. But I do think that those practices of self-compassion, and then also really giving them to our partners and our friends and the rest of our parenting sangha and community, giving them, you know, permission to forgive themselves, giving them permission to be not a perfect parent all the time. I think that's really so key. I also think it's gendered to an extent. I think, there's different pressures on men and women as it relates to being parents, and different cultures within our larger culture as it relates to being a parent, about what's expected of us. And so the guilt manifests in different ways. But I do think letting go of the idea that we have to be a perfect parent, that we just have to be good enough, and setting that as our intention, putting a hand over your heart and just saying, may I be a good enough parent today? May I let go of perfection? Finding what phrases work for us. May I keep myself and my family safe today? Right? Sort of variations on some of those meta phrases. May I find and help my child find the roots of happiness and contentment. And setting those as intentions, right? Which I think is so much better than setting them as commandments for ourselves.
Yeah. So I want to get into, like, this is such a crazy time to either, I imagine, work with young people the way you do, or be a parent, in terms of just what the world looks like right now. I mean, this will, we're recording this about a week before the U.S. elections, but because of the way the podcast schedules work, we're talking about a few weeks after the elections. So, we can project into the future and hope maybe a little bit of sanity is restored. Last night, like, a radical fascist won the
in Brazil,
presidency of Brazil. I have a few close Brazilian friends who are just very scared for their families right now. The UN's climate report just has a sense of impending, Blade Runner style disaster. Do you talk to, like, your 4-year-old? Do you have any conversations that are about, like, the threat of fascism, or, like, is there any way to bring that in without it being overwhelming, or is it just like, oh, there's Donald Trump on TV, he's slightly obnoxious, but may he be happy?
It doesn't come up with him. I am a constantly recovering and relapsing news junkie. So I try to, titrate the amount of news that I take in, but for years it was NPR in the car, and his drive to school is only 5 minutes, but it's, just in 5 minutes on NPR, and he catches everything. He's got a lot of questions, so I don't listen to it in the car anymore. At this age, what I'm really trying to do is protect him from that stuff and teach him good values that are about being kind, being generous, acting in ways that are ethical and caring and helpful, and really trying to teach those just kinds of basics, as well as understanding his own emotional experience and how he can regulate himself to respond rather than react to difficult situations, so that he can build up those muscles that hopefully by the time he's older, right, he can really be some kind of helper in this world. I always love the Mr. Rogers, or technically it's Mr. Rogers' mother, right, who said, right, always look for the helpers in these awful situations. We're coming off the weekend with this awful shooting in Pittsburgh, and in Kentucky, and the bombs being sent out. But it is kind of helping, I do think looking for the helpers. And then I think more than that, being the helpers, right? How do we be the helpers? How do I raise my son, not just to see that there are helpful people in the world, but how can he become one of them? How can he become active and involved and engaged in positive change in this world? And I do think that can start at this young age by teaching simple acts of kindness, and teaching generosity, and teaching sharing, and teaching being welcoming to the new kids in his preschool class is, like the first step toward being welcoming toward refugees coming into this country. Being kind and generous and sharing his sandwich at lunchtime is the first step in teaching him how to, share other things in this life. So I do feel like, these are what I'm trying to teach him at this age, not not what's quite so scary in this scary world, in this scary time.
Do you think there's any particular responsibility, especially everything going on in this world, to being a mindful dad? In terms of what the role of the father is, in terms of sort of rethinking. It's an interesting question, because part of the conversation I had on my last podcast was about what's going on in the Shambhala tradition, and one thing that came in is how patriarchal actually Asian Buddhism was, right? So it's not just kind of the Western misogynistic, that gives rise to the Me Too era and all of these other things. It's Buddhism has a very patriarchal history too. And I think, one of the points I made on that podcast is we maybe try to think that, because there's also these like kindness, compassion practices, that it's like a more evolved patriarchy in some ways. But what is if you're a dad who doesn't believe in patriarchy, let's put it that way, you believe in sort of, a co-created parenting system, and you believe the, innate wisdom and basic goodness of all beings, regardless of gender or family position. Like but you still live in a patriarchal society. Like, is there a particular responsibility to being a dad with these practices these days?
I think so. I think they're absolutely, I think beyond responsibility, I think imperative. And I think it's modeling it. And I think it's always trying to learn myself. I feel like, I went to like a super liberal college and grew up in a like progressive place. And so for a while I was like, oh, I'm good. I got this. Right. Like, and then in the last few years, I just really have had my eyes open so much more around privilege and the responsibility that comes with that, and what I have that other people don't, that I'm just not even aware of, just walking around in this world. And so I do think it is so critical to be modeling for myself that I'm learning about those kinds of topics, and modeling really different kinds of behavior, and then modeling also for my son and for my daughter, just how to behave ethically, how to be caring and compassionate. My sister had sent me an article recently about boys and the importance of letting boys have roles as caregivers as they're growing up, to do some babysitting, to do some caregiving, to spend, even a few minutes with their little cousins or little siblings, and that really teaches them empathy in terms of like, oh, this is comfortable or uncomfortable, or this is, just sort of how other people are reacting, just that's sort of around consent and those kinds of questions that have come up so much recently, or have been around forever but have been more in the popular conversation recently. So I do feel that as fathers in particular, we have a real responsibility toward our sons and toward our daughters, and just real opportunity. I think, responsibility can feel so heavy, right? It's like, no, this is an opportunity to make something really different and create a different generation going forward.
So you're clearly you're clearly one of the folks who's working in a Western psychological framework and bringing in principles that originate from Buddhism, and there's so many people working that way, and obviously Buddhism has this view in our society where everything either has to be a secular or a religious identity, as it's sort of maybe a cooler Asian religion, but it's still a religion. And so, obviously when somebody like a John Kabat-Zinn, or even somebody like a Richie Davidson, who's studying Buddhist meditators from a neuroscientific standpoint, when they're studying these things, they have to be careful about kind of secularizing things. But it's also, I was talking with a friend who's doing a meditation program behind the scenes with a major tech company that already had like a mindfulness program. And they said they actually want deeper teachings than that. Right? So it's interesting to me as somebody who's more coming at it from the other side, that I'm trained as a Buddhist teacher, and I've studied a lot of the Western psychological concepts because I'm so interested in the psychology of the whole thing. Like, first of all, do you make this strong distinction when you're working with someone between like Buddhism as an Eastern or more religious or spiritual thing, and mindfulness or self-compassion as, secularized, scientifically studied tools or techniques? Or do they kind of come together for you? Or how do you separate?
For me, they really just come together on on so many different levels. But then as far as teaching is concerned, I feel like I'm kind of code switching depending on my audience. I'll go and do a talk at the Pioneer Valley Insight Meditation Center for the Parenting Sangha, and it'll be much more laden with Buddhist kind of language. And I'll do a talk at a science conference or an educational conference, and it'll be much more laden with kind of neuroscience terms and statistics and that kind of thing. And for myself, I just really see these as complementing each other and essentially just being different vocabulary to describe the same thing. And so I can feel stretched at certain times, and I wish I didn't have to switch on and switch off in different settings, but that is kind of the world that we live in some ways. And that's, in some ways, that's what I tried to do in this last book, Raising Resilience, which is really looking at the paramis through a scientific angle and a child development angle, and really bringing things together. But of course, that book didn't sell that well because it didn't have mindfulness in the title. So what are you going to do? Or Buddhism in the title, right? It just, people weren't quite sure what to make of it. So it can be hard, I think, on that way to figure out how to reach people on either end of it.
Right. So some of it is some of the code switching is not, it's not really separating these things out experientially or in terms of their intention. I remember having a conversation with a friend who was a cognitive behavioral therapist, and basically they were trying to talk about the difference between CBT and Buddhist thought, which actually CBT to me is probably the most dharmic, at least structurally, of all, at least present moment awareness based of all the Western psychology. Yeah. But it was interesting because he was saying that the purpose of cognitive behavioral therapy is symptomatic. It's short term. It's working with a particular issue that the patient or client comes in with, whereas the purpose of Buddhism is a much deeper, longer term awakening. So it's kind of weird. Even in his comparison, he was basically saying Buddhism's about a lot more. He wasn't saying they're about different things. He was saying, so my question was why would anybody go for CBT then when you can go for something that's a lot more transformative and is not just addressing one or a few symptoms or.
Right. And I think it's again, it goes back to sort of what's an entry point for people, right? Some people might be drawn specifically to a Buddhist temple for its beauty, and that maybe that's a really superficial reason to go, or go because there's someone attractive who's there, or go because it's the opposite of what the tradition you grew up in, right? Or tradition you were maybe pushed out of because of different sort of identity markers or something like that. Or maybe, CBT and psychotherapy is the entry door for you. So I think it's, and I agree with you. I think CBT is in some way, it's a kind of a superficial, symptom management, not lifestyle choice in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
In terms of the aspect of bringing in the Dharma, one thing that seems like it's really compelling for family situations is not so much the religiosity of it, but it presents a quality of bringing certain shared ceremonies into life. The idea of a family bowing at the beginning of a meal or, contemplating or, doing one of the Zen chants or something else about the interdependence of the meal. That sort of aspect of if you look at religion one way as if it's this sort of metaphysical or overarching set of beliefs about the universe, that can become problematic from any kind of scientific or secular standpoint. But if you look at it as an enriched environment of this is how we acknowledge the day together, this is how we acknowledge Sangha or community.
Right.
It seems and thinking about growing up Buddhist, those were the things that I remembered the most when I
Mm-hmm.
started getting into the more psychological practices later on was like when we bowed to each other, or like the gong ringing, or ceremonial markers that bring you into some shared space. So do you have any Dharma ceremonies that you do with your kids yet?
Not so much, but I do think at this point we don't. We're trying to figure out what those might be. We do a little practice before bed almost every night. And as he gets older, I think we want to start doing some kind of gratitude practice in the evening as we check in with each other. And then also hopefully doing more family retreats as those become more popular too. And I do think there's something, again, this sort of like, is it neuroscience? Is it religion? I do feel like ritual is so important and so powerful. And it's so deeply in our DNA that ritual does do something for us. Right. I mean, we could say, a few words of gratitude. We could do a gratitude list at dinner, or we could say grace, right? They're kind of the same thing. Or we could say, so many different prayers or different practices from different spiritual traditions. So you can believe in anything, or not to be an absolute atheist and believe just in the science side of it. But all these practices, like you said, they do serve such a purpose. And I think especially for kids, to be able to grow up with ritual, with tradition, it makes things predictable, which is helpful. It makes you feel connected to yourself and to a larger culture or a larger group of people. So I do feel like ritual is so important in figuring out where to bring it in, and it's challenging about our modern culture. Like what new rituals do we add? Which ones do we let go of? Which ones are still helpful to us in the modern world? Which ones are kind of dragging us down in some ways from our family? Just as, which of our family, just any of our family values and baggage do we want to let go of? And which ones do we want to keep passing forward? It's a challenging question, but I'm a strong believer in ritual, both from the spiritual side, the community side, and the scientific angle. I thought about writing a book called The Atheist Guide to Religion that was kind of like about all those ideas about how important ritual can be.
Awesome. I think atheists are the most religious people among us.
Yeah. Well, they know what they believe.
Yeah. If you want to be truly secular, I think you have to be agnostic. But
yeah.
What are you working on next?
I've got a bunch of things coming out next year, a bunch of kids' books, which is so exciting because I've got a kid and hopefully he'll still be able to appreciate them. He won't be too old for them. It's like you get inspired right when they're a certain age, and then it's like, oh, he's going to outgrow it, but just in time for his little sister, May. Daniel Rechtschaffen, I don't know if you know him, great guy. He and I are doing this book called Alpha Breaths. That's an alphabet book of different breathing practices. It's just kind of fun and goofy and silly. A is for the alligator breath and B is for the butterfly breath, that kind of thing. And then my wife and I just kind of on a whim, I don't know if you're familiar, and parents in the audience, if you're familiar with the book Press Here. It's a really great book for kind of 2 to 4 year olds. It's a very interactive kind of book. And my wife and I are thinking like, we could do like a mindfulness version of this. So you pick up the book and it says, sort of like, look deeply at the page. Can you see how this used to be a tree? Can you see the sunshine? Sort of like the Thich Nhat Hanh thing. And then turn the page. Can you hear the sound of the page turning? Does turning page 12 sound different than turning page 36? And can you put the book on your belly and feel your belly moving up and down with the breath? So it's this kind of fun, interactive concept. And those will be happening next year, and they're all done at this point. So I'm kind of now between things. I am doing an online parenting, actually Science and Spirit of Buddhist Parenting course with Shambhala Press. That should be coming out pretty soon. But then as far as like a big new project or book, I don't have like a specific thing. So I'm kind of waiting to see what arises and what really gets my passion going more long term, so I don't jump off a project like I did with that self-compassion parenting book. But I'm really, really deeply excited about something. So,
do you ever get sick of talking about kids and parenting, or?
Yes.
Do you ever want to talk about like the Dharma of baseball? Or?
It's fun. I get sick of thinking about talking about it, and then I start talking and I see people start to make the connections, and I'm glad I'm doing it. But when I think about the fact that like, I don't even know where I'm speaking next week, to give a talk about this, my heart kind of sinks a little bit. But then when I see people's response, I feel inspired again. But I am looking at, what else is out there, like what other material do I want to wrestle with? And thinking more deeply about that. So sort of this, atheist guide to spirituality is exciting to me, bringing meaningfulness into the workplace. Meaningfulness and spirituality to activism feels important in this day and age. So there's a lot. Yeah.
Well, awesome. So I'm just going to mention your website, which is drchristopherwillard.com, which is drchristopher, WILLARD.com, if people want to get more info. And I'll probably be in touch with more questions because Izzy's an amazing human, but I kind of have no idea what I'm doing, but she seems to be fine. She smiles a lot. So
don't know mind, right?
Yeah.
Don't know either of our minds.
And let's just hope there's a really good and compassionate and healthy world an inclusive world for these kids to grow up in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So and we'll definitely have you back on sometime, hopefully before they're teenagers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hopefully we can meet in person one of these days too. It would be just great.
That would be awesome. I think I know where you went to college, and I think I know a lot of people who went to that college, and they were all like, I got this. So
I think so too. Nice. Awesome.
So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Chris Willard. And for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see you all next time.